Jackie, I guess it's the want of politicians, is it, when they leave to, in actual fact, always show themselves in good light and everybody else in a bad one? Yeah? Australian politicians any different?
No, absolutely no different. And just listening to talk to you about that, of course, you and I were in and around politics in the mid-'80s. So the names that you were talking about and what was happening is, gosh, brought back lots of memories.
Oh, it's just remarkable, though, how when the Labor Party talk, and modern Labor Party, and James Jacinda Ardern talk about the Labor, heritage, they deliberately miss out those years, 1984 to 1990.
Yeah. Well, if you say something often enough, it might be regarded as true. But, the rewriting and recasting of history, I actually think it's ignorance and arrogance, really, and wanton ignorance and arrogance, or both.
Good on you. Agreed. Hey, now, Jackie, there's something else I wanted to ask you too, and that was just to do with Australia. Oh, yeah. One thing I did notice this week was that there has been those elections in, was it Queensland?
Yes, we've had two by-elections in Queensland.
Now, these are not for the state parliament, are they? They are for the federal parliament in Canberra?
No, they're for state. So, unlike New Zealand, we have one happy family in New Zealand. We've got states here in Australia. And so they have state elections and we have federal elections. And so, in fact, Queensland's state election is in October this year. And I've had to have two by-elections because the previous Premier Palaszczuk resigned and then someone was sick. So last weekend they had two by-elections.
Right. And it was seen as a test of the government's popularity in the wider public, yeah?
Yeah, pretty much. And so you've got a Labor government in Queensland. Of course, we have Labor at federal. And, so the swings against Labor was something like 18% in one electorate and 21% in another. So
bloody
thumpingly bad result.
Yeah.
And of course, the feds were saying, "Oh, well, it doesn't translate to federal," but they must be terrified.
Is that, and also in terms of you've got a news poll? I think the Australian Commissioner, it seems to be quite authoritative. It runs every month or so. Is that reflected in the polls at a national level as well?
No, look, federally it is different, and we spoke a couple of weeks ago about the by-election down in Victoria, whether I think there was not such a major swing. So Queensland's is pretty bad, and federally it's much closer, but it's almost too close to call. And also, if the Labor really wants to have a hope in winning next year for the federal election, they're not going to get anything out of Queensland, and they're possibly going to lose seats. And I've got some concerns in Western Australia. So, at a federal level, the Queensland result would be very worrying for them, because they can't really afford to lose anything, and if the independents keep their seats and you've got a couple of other independents, you've really got a position where neither of the two major parties is probably going to get a majority, and we'll be back into having long conversations about, pulling together coalitions of various sorts, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, well, we do that every year, or every 3 years, as you know. Listen, can I just ask another question of you, Jackie, and it's this. Here in New Zealand, we know that the culture wars, I don't know where they started, but they started somewhere, not here. We've imported them into New Zealand, and now it's almost like a permanent Springbok tour where, on any given issue, you have to choose sides. You're either woke or anti-woke, basically. Are you finding, and so the culture wars are starting to become more divisive and more permanent here, I guess is the best way of describing them. Are you finding in Australia the same thing, number one? And number two, does it depend upon which state you're in?
Definitely same thing happening here, and I think probably we were if further along is the right descriptor than New Zealand. I think we're further along in a lot of ways because a lot of our state and federal laws are changing in response to this. So there's just been a vote in the New South Wales Parliament to ban gender assignment therapy, gender assignment surgery and stuff like this. So it's, it's very much a fact of life, and the speed at which, interest groups or those who speak loudest can then seem to generate an interest in a political party and get laws and legislation through, I think is actually quite worrying. And I think that it's the parties being kind of almost, we've got to make sure that we make sure we kind of protect these interest groups so that they can support us in the elections. So it's I think we're further along here, but definitely you can't be someone like me, for instance, who I don't have vociferous views about many things. I actually want to talk about both sides of it, but you're almost kind of forced into one or the other, and you have to be reasonably articulate if you don't want to take that position.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. So the reasonable person in the middle who can be conservative one moment, liberal the next, has to choose one side or the other. Yeah, that's right.
Listen, or on a particular topic, So you don't fit into one or the other.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Everything's now black and white in the culture wars. It's my side or your side. It's tribalism gone mad. Listen, the other thing I'm interested in also, talking about tribalism, and that is that the United States of America obviously has their elections at the end of this year, and if you want to see a culture war, boy, that will be, on a significant scale. You've got an Australian ambassador to the US by the name of Kevin Rudd. He's a former Labor Prime Minister. He was appointed by Albanese, I think, to that role. And it would appear that if Donald Trump, and it increasingly looking like he will be, is elected President of the United States, there will be some form of diplomatic impasse. Can you give us some background to that?
Yeah, look, Kevin 07, we call Kevin Rudd, our Prime Minister that just kept on going, 24 hours a day and exhausted everybody, including himself. Always has regarded himself as a bit of a intellect and commentator. He was kind of appointed to the ambassadorial role in the US. And in his period of being outside politics and, being a commentator on pretty much anything, anyone would ask him, he wasn't very charitable about, Donald Trump. So it's completely understandable why Donald, who just likes throwing a bomb to see what happens, come up and decided to have a bit of a go at Kevin. Called him not the brightest bulb, I think.
He would have hated that.
Well, nothing worse for Kevin, I would imagine, that someone says he's not that, because Kevin, I think, sees himself as a bit of an intellect. Not surprised. I guess what's surprising from my perspective is why even Kevin would come up on the Don's radar, quite frankly. That's typical Trump, throw a bomb and keep moving and just watch the mayhem follow on behind. Albanese's come out and said, how dare he, and he wouldn't, remove Kevin. I don't think most people really care where Kevin ends up, quite frankly. So they're all getting a bit sort of puffed up all about it, and I think Donald's probably having a bit of fun.
Yeah, well, the other thing that strikes me, though, is you've got another Australian Prime Minister who's gone rogue too, another ex-Labor Australian Prime Minister, and that's Paul Keating. He was the Minister of Finance to Bob Hawke, then took over as the Prime Minister. An acidic personality, I think, would be a kind way of describing him. But he's set himself up now as very much the leading advocate in Australia against closer relationships between Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States, particularly with AUKUS. How is Keating regarded? Is he regarded as authority? Because he seems to be running an extraordinarily pro-China line.
Keating's an interesting guy, and I've interviewed him a couple of times, actually. He is extremely smart and intelligent. He's always kind of taken his own pathway. He doesn't pop his head up that often, but when he does, you're certainly not going to miss him. And he has always had a very strong independent streak about his views about things, and is quite prepared to back them up. So I think he commands a lot of respect, and often it's not really potentially politically aligned, unusually. He just creates, he has a view about something and he's more than happy to share it, and he's usually very good at prosecuting it.
Well, let's go to AUKUS, for example. Yeah. The Labor government have continued with the AUKUS military alliance, essentially, with the UK and the US. They intend to construct, I think, nuclear submarines as part of that, but it's also much wider in terms of the relationship dynamics. Labor is seen as woke, but they don't seem to be resiling from AUKUS, and yet it's caused some consternation within the Labor Party. Have I got that right?
Sort of. So first thing, we call it AUKUS here.
Oh, AUKUS, okay.
Don't know why, but there you go. Look, I think in terms of defence and regional security, that Australia really is, both parties, I think, are pretty aligned. And I think rightly so. And we've talked about this before, that, Australia has a much, I guess, deeper kind of resonance in terms of being a regional player, because, it's important in the Pacific and a lot closer to us here, quite frankly. And, Indonesia's a small boat trip away, which is why we have an issue with people arriving by boat. So I think that whilst there might be some differences at the edges, I think both Labor and the Libs are pretty well aligned in terms of defence. There's the AUKUS agreement is an agreement for the UK and the US to provide a combination of the new Virginia-class submarines from America and then develop submarines with the UK. It's a 30, 40-year defence program worth $360 billion.
That's a lot of money.
There's a lot of money. And part of that is that Australia is providing billions to both the US and the UK. And yesterday, Australia signed a $5 billion deal with the UK to basically help build out the manufacturing capacity in both the UK and the US for the subs, to ensure that these sub projects are actually happening quicker than they normally would, so that we can get the submarines. So it's a big bet for all of Australia, multi-generational. Whether it will, the subs will actually happen, who knows, who can see that far ahead, but sizable commitment over the next 20, 30 years.